Great. So hi, thanks so much for coming. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the research I've been doing over the past 12 years now, which feels like a long time, but I am an assistant professor at the University of Western Ontario. So even though it has Western in the name, it's kind of a misnomer. It's Western Ontario. So it's actually on the eastern side of North America. So it's 5 o'clock my time now. But I've been studying how small birds survive harsh montane winters and trying to understand their behavior for some time, particularly with regard to mountain chickadees. That's the study system that I work in. But I work with other chickadee species as well. And it actually all started for me as an undergraduate. So I like to give a little bit of background to kind of remove the veil of what academics are and sort of how we get where we've gotten to, and bring about the winding path that can lead to becoming an assistant professor that studies small birds. So I grew up in Eastern Tennessee. Oh, let's see here. There we go. I grew up in East Tennessee, where I went to the University of Tennessee, and that's where I discovered the beautiful wildlife that was there, and grew up in that area, and started working with small songbirds. I wasn't really interested in birds. I had never worked with birds or been interested in birds when I was younger, but I started working in Todd Freeberg's lab, and he studied comparative communication, and I started doing field work with a PhD student, Jessica Owens, and this really lit a fire under me, and turned out to be what I was passionate about, that I didn't even know existed prior to going to university. So this really set me on this trajectory to where I wanted to study communication and potentially cognition in animals. I'd always been in love with animals, but didn't want to be a veterinarian. So this seemed like a really great approach. So after undergraduate, I went on to do my master's at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where I actually studied animal cognition in lab rats. So you can see that little lab rat there in this spatial array arena that we test their olfactory response in, so they can remember up to 72 stimuli within one day. So the different scents that they have access to, which is really quite incredible. And doing that work was really interesting, but I learned a lot about what I didn't want to do, which was to work exclusively in a lab with lab rats. I wanted to get back into the field and work more in an ecologically relevant setting. And so I actually headed out to the University of Nevada, Reno, which is quite close to Tahoe. And that's where I did my PhD work, went on to work on a postdoctoral project with this lab group and in this system as well. And I continue to work in this system today. So I go out to the field in the summertime, not doing the winter work these days, but did quite a bit of that. And I'm very interested in both the cognitive abilities of these birds and their communication and mating systems. And so that's what I'll talk about today, is some of that research. Okay, so when we think about how harsh winters can get in North American temperate zones, right? We probably think about how animals are able to survive these winters, right? And so there's a few different ways that they can go about this, right? So the idea is that in general, it gets colder. That means it's causing more energy or taking more energy and more of a challenge on your metabolism in order to maintain your body temperature or homeostasis, right? And so what we often think of is that animals hibernate, right? So we think of black bears that hibernate, and then small mammals as well, like this 13-lined ground squirrel here, but all kinds of species actually hibernate. And the idea here is that you eat a bunch of food before going in for hibernation, and then you sleep through it, right? So you reduce the amount of energy you actually need to survive. You just sort of go into a hibernating state. But we also see this in spotted salamanders and garter snakes. There's lots of species across different animal systems that actually use this strategy. The other one might be that you leave, right? So if it's going to get cold where you are, then the alternative is to move to a new location, right? And so we can think about that in terms of a lot of bird species that migrate. That's often what comes to mind. But many different species, again, across taxa migrate. So you can see here on the bottom, we have monarch butterflies. I believe that's a gopher snake or rattlesnake on the bottom there, salmon, ungulates, bats, all types of animals, again, are migrating from colder temperatures to warmer climates where food will be more abundant, right? So in a lot of these instances, we really only see these animals for maybe a third of their lifespan, right? And so then the final one that I think of often is what the birds I study do, which is that they end up storing food to use for later. So the idea here is that instead of leaving or going underground or going into hibernation, you can just store food, create your own refrigerator, basically your own cupboard, so that you can access food throughout that time when it's scarce, right? In the temperate environments, there aren't berries flowering, there aren't fruits available to these animals, so they need to store these things. In particular, pine seeds is what many of these species are storing. And so this can manifest in quite a gradient. So this goes from, sort of scatter hoarding species to larder hoarding species. And what I mean by that is some individuals will scatter different individual pieces of food across their territory and recover each individual item or maybe a few items in one location. The other end of that is what we call larder hoarders. So where they would put all of their food into one location and then just defend that location itself. So you can imagine there's some trade-offs there in terms of if an individual finds your food source or finds your hoard, they would be able to take it all because there's only one spot, as opposed to scatter hoarding. Potentially that is harder for other individuals to steal from you, but it comes with the cost of needing really highly advanced cognitive abilities to actually remember where those different storing locations are, right? And so we can see this again across a gradient of species. Things like Carolina scrub jays and gray squirrels are what we call scatter hoarding species. There's some in the middle, like Clark's nutcrackers and pinyon jays, that cache a crazy number of food items, but they'll cache more than one in a single location. And then finally, we can think of things like our acorn woodpecker and red squirrels that are hoarding or more larder hoarders. So acorn woodpeckers create these granaries where they put different acorns or lots of acorns all in one general location, right? Okay, so here's an example of the mountain chickadee caching in progress. So what's interesting about mountain chickadees is they actually cache their food items in the bark of the tree. So instead of going into under the ground, right? So under the ground isn't a great place, or on the ground isn't a great place for caching food items if there's going to be 20 feet of snow coming throughout the year, right? They can't access that. So while other bird species and squirrel species will burrow underneath the ground and get access to their caches, these smaller birds don't tend to do that. And so they're caching all throughout the pieces of bark, along the trees, in different parts of lichen, things like that, that they can then get access to later. Okay, so what's underlying this spatial cognitive ability, right? So again, spatial cognition just being an animal's ability to move through space using a variety of different cues and information. This can be things like landmarks or beacons that are associated with a particular site, but they can also be like just a general knowledge of sort of where you are in space in terms of how to orient and navigate. And what we know about spatial cognition is that its underlying brain regions are the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is in the human brain, but we also have an analog in the songbird brain. And so while the hippocampus is inside and sort of internal in the brain of humans, it's actually right on top of the brain of bird species. And this makes it actually pretty tractable and easy to measure in birds. And so folks have done a lot of this work and shown that indeed spatial cognition is underlined by this hippocampus, this area of the brain. But how do we study this, right? And how does it differ from other types of learning and memory and ways that animals orient in their environment, right? So the key here is the spatial cue, right? Which again can be many different things. So for example, in this picture that I'm showing you, there's a radial arm maze up in the top left. And then on the bottom corner, that would just be sort of a tabletop, again, it's not a radial arm maze, but that's a general spatial arena where everything is equidistant in terms of the rewarding locations. And the animal will be placed in the center of either of those mazes or arenas. And then they have to locate where the food item is in space, right? And so in that top photo there, a landmark might be that desk on the right, or the other desk that looks slightly different on the left, or you could have something on the walls, right? But in terms of the actual reward location itself, there are no local cues there other than space, right? So it's not a certain color, it's not associated with a certain pattern, anything like that, right? So the animal has to be able to orient in space in order to find its location. And that's a bit how it differs from other types of cognitive abilities. Okay, so shifting gears into hopefully the exciting part, or the star of the show, our mountain chickadee friend here. So here's a photo or a map of the distribution of mountain chickadees in northwest, north in the montane regions of North America, right, is where these birds reside. So you can see the distribution there. And of course, down in the Sierras, hopefully you can see how dark purple that is. That suggests how abundant they are in the Sierra Nevada. And they're highly abundant there. And we study them at Sage Hen Creek Field Station. We've been working there again for 12 years. My PhD advisor has been working there for much longer than that. But we've been consistently tagging these birds and sort of tracking their behavior year round for 12 years. So these birds are non-migratory. That means that they don't move, right? They stay right where they are. They're actually quite sedentary. So after they move from their natal site, when they fledge, they stay in that same location for the rest of their lives. They are food caching birds, spoiler alert. So they are what we call scatter cachers, right? Like I described before, they cache all throughout their territory and recover those individual items. And they use their specialized spatial cognition to do that. They also live in stable dominance hierarchies. So there may be 10 individuals in a flock. They will actually be paired within that flock in the fall with a female, a male and female pair. And the way that their dominance hierarchy works is that the males are dominant to the females and adults are generally dominant to juveniles, right? So there's this very stable dominance hierarchy. And the reason they stay in these groups, we joke that they're begrudgingly social because they don't necessarily like each other or snuggle up together for warmth, like you might imagine an animal in a cold environment would do. But they do this to survive, right? It's been shown that being part of a flock is critical for survival in these birds, because this means you have more eyes and ears to find food, as well as to avoid predation, right? So that's really important for these birds. They're also what we call socially monogamous. This is true for most bird species. I think over 80% of birds are socially monogamous. So while they'll have a pair or a partner that they're mated with, that they stay with typically for that breeding year, but often for years to come, they will seek extra pair paternity outside of their social pair. So that just means that they will have offspring with other individuals. Birds are cool in that way, in the sense that they fertilize each egg as it gets laid. And so they can lay multiple across, several days. And those might have different parentage depending on female mating decisions and things of that nature. Okay, so we study these birds in the Sierras, as I mentioned. And the beautiful thing about this is that, these elevation gradients and montane environments provide natural experiments, right? So across this really small spatial scale of 6 kilometers, we're looking at a difference in snow cover that's quite significant. So what we're seeing here is at the bottom of the mountain is our low elevation site, which is around 1,900 or 2,000 meters. And as you can see there's no snow cover in that photo, as opposed to our high elevation site, which is around 2,500 meters. And this site, as you can see there, is still covered in snow. And I don't have to convince this audience, I'm sure, that this is the reality that these birds are experiencing. But these photos are taken on the same day. So we've got no snow at our low elevation site, and still about 2 meters or about 6 feet of snow at our high elevation site, right? So there's this natural difference in environment and in heterogeneity that these birds are experiencing. And as a result of that, we would expect them to have differences in selection based on their environmental pressures, right? So more snow cover, longer snow cover, colder temperatures. These birds likely are experiencing more selection on their spatial cognition so that they can recover all the food items that they've cached and actually survive the winter. So this is sort of the hypothesis leading to a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today, and sort of how we've shown that natural selection is actually acting on this trait. Okay, so the first thing that happened before I joined this lab group, they took birds. So previous work was done looking across a latitudinal gradient in terms of spatial cognitive abilities to look at whether or not individuals living in these really harsh environments, so these birds living at high latitudes, right? So further north in Canada, as opposed to those further south in the US, if they had differences in their spatial cognitive abilities based on the difference in environment. So after showing that absolutely that's true, they wanted to replicate this on a smaller gradient. So we did this across these high and low elevation sites. And so we brought birds from high elevation sites and low elevation sites into our lab and tested their caching propensity. So how much are they caching, their spatial memory ability, et cetera, right? And so what we see is that individuals from high elevations, they indeed cache more food items, as we would have predicted compared to low elevation birds. They perform better on spatial memory tasks, so they make fewer errors on these tasks compared to low elevation birds, while we don't see that same difference in something like a color association task. So that's really interesting. In addition, they have larger hippocampi, so that, again, that area of the brain that's associated with spatial cognition, it's larger in these high elevation birds, and it has more neurons and more neuron connections than low elevation birds. And then finally, what we also showed when I first started my PhD was that individuals from low elevation are actually dominant to high elevation birds, right? And as I mentioned, this is really critical for these birds, and they, being in a flock in general is important, but having dominant status is critical because it gives you better access to food, territories, and mates as well. So there's a lot of benefits there. So you can see this potential effect where it seems like high elevation birds are well suited to high elevations with their better cognitive abilities. And potentially they can't move down, because if they were to move down to lower elevations, they would experience a loss in their fitness or their reproductive and survival abilities because they're less dominant, right? And then the reverse is true for low elevation birds, right? Maybe they could move up if they had good enough cognitive abilities, but if they don't, they're not going to survive those harsh winters, right? And so staying at low elevation might be better. So it seems like what we're seeing is local adaptation on this small elevational scale, right? Within these 6 kilometers, the birds aren't moving very far. We do know there's some genetic mixture there in terms of, like, there is some breeding, there's some crossover, but it's very low. And of course, this is all done in the lab, right? Which is strongly suggestive that selection, so what we call natural selection, right, is acting on this trait and increasing these birds' abilities to perform well on this task. But if you're going to talk about natural selection, you really have to bring it into the field and see what the birds are doing in the wild in their own natural environment, right? We can't breed these birds or do selection experiments in the lab like you might be able to do with some, small fly species and things like that, which is what people typically do when they're looking at selection, right? So we had to go in the field to do this. And the beautiful thing about mountain chickadees, I think, or chickadees in general, or any resident bird, is that they're around all year. So we can collect data from all facets of their life, not just that 1/3 that they're spending with us during the breeding season. So that's exactly what we do. So we started by, collecting birds, trapping them, and putting pit tags on them and other little tags so we can identify who they are, taking blood samples so we can look at their genetic and their paternity. Then when the fall hits, we actually start testing their cognitive abilities, and I'll explain a little more about what this task entails. So you can see that here, that there's a spatial array hoisted up in the trees, and then that photo is a picture of a bird getting access to the feeder. So we start testing their cognitive abilities in the winter when they'll visit our feeders. As the spring comes about, we have about 400 nest boxes at our field site between the 2 elevations. And these birds are what we call secondary cavity nesters. So they'll readily nest in these human-made nest boxes for us, which is very convenient. And at the same time, I'm collecting recordings of their song because I'm interested in how male song impacts female mate choice, which again, I'll speak to in just a bit. And then as the summer progresses, we tag all of the nestlings, little grumpy buddies there. They're the cutest. We tag those with aluminum USGS bands. And that way we can see if we get them recruited back into our population. And then if we catch them again, we'll give them those pit tags and other bands, as well as banding the parents at those nest boxes. So this is sort of the way that we collect all of our data throughout the year annually. And then we can use this information to ask all kinds of questions about how their cognitive abilities are associated with other factors in their lifetime. So how do we assess spatial memory in the wild? So this will be the task that we use for all of these other experiments that I'll describe that we see relationships with. So again, there's a bird on a perch sitting there with a purple pit tag on. So that is like a similar tag that might be in your pet. If you were to lose your dog, they hopefully are microchipped so that someone could read that and get information about them. You can see myself and Ben Sonnenberg assessing the feeders on the bottom there. So we have to bring them down from the trees, change their batteries out, take the data, all of that jazz. And then again, you can see them hoisted up in the trees there. And so how do we analyze who's doing what and what does this mean? There's this array of feeders, but what does that look like, right? And so what we do is, so this is a little chickadee's eye view here on the left. And you can see, again, it's that spatial array. So the only thing that differs in our array itself is the actual spatial location, right? And all of these feeders give birds access to food in the beginning. Then we close them, get them used to the doors opening and closing. And then we assign them to a single feeder. So for instance, if this bird is assigned to that feeder there at the bottom, we can then look at the number of errors that bird makes prior to going to the correct feeder, right? So he might come and visit this feeder first, and that would be an error, one error. He might come over here and check, that's another error. And then he'll come to his correct feeder, and that's the correct one, right? So on the first trial where the feeders are closed and he only gets access to this one, it'll take him a minute to learn which feeder is his, right? But then from there, we expect the number of errors that they make to go down, right? In this instance, on that trial, he made 2 errors, right? In the future, he most likely will make fewer errors than that. And we can average how many errors they make across trials as a measure of their performance. And I should say each individual bird gets assigned a different feeder, right? So they only have the one that's rewarding them once the testing takes place, but multiple birds will be at different feeders across that array. And we have 2 of these set up at our high elevation site, and we have 2 set up at our low elevation site. We end up testing about 100 birds at each elevation each year. So it's fairly powerful in that way. So here's what this looks like when a bird lands and gets access. So that feeder perch has a radio frequency identification technology in there. And chickadees are great because unlike some other species, they don't just sit on the feeder. They'll take that seed and then they fly away and they either cache that or eat it right away, right? So they just take one per time. Now, if you're wondering why we're hoisting them up into the trees and not on the ground, these are the culprits. So we were training some bears for a while on their cognitive abilities, and they did very well finding our feeders on the ground and trying to destroy them. That's what we call an unwelcome mat to try to deter them. There's little nails sticking out of there, but they basically played on it. So we ended up coming with the solution of putting them up into the sky, which worked pretty well. So what we can do is look at individuals that perform really well on this task, right? So the ones that make fewer errors, and compare those to individuals that make more errors and see if this leads to enhanced survivability, more mates, all of these different parameters. So the first question we ask, right, is simply, do individuals that perform better on the task, are they more likely to survive winter, right? So fairly like simple question, and that's a photo from our field site there. And so we can look at this across a couple of measures, and we can compare this between adults and juveniles. We would expect adults to perform better on average because the variation is gone from the juvenile birds, right? They actually don't get better on the task over time, which is interesting. And so what we can see here is across on our x-axis, so on the bottom there, we're looking at the first 3 trials, 5 trials, 10 trials, and 20. And then remembering that the mean number of errors they make, so less errors is better performance. And so that's what we see here. So we can look at how individuals that survived versus individuals that died survived or performed on this task, right? And what we're seeing here in blue are individuals that did not make it to the next winter compared to those that survived. And so we see that individuals with better cognitive abilities, right, make fewer errors, are more likely to survive to the next winter than those that didn't perform well on that task. And then we can do the same thing again for adults versus juveniles. So here again, same structure of that figure. And what we're seeing is that adults are performing significantly better than juveniles are on this task. And again, that makes sense, right? If a big majority of the individuals that perform poorly their first year don't make it to the next year, then we would expect adults to be performing better because of that. So that's really exciting. It shows that indeed, selection is acting on these birds' spatial cognitive abilities. And again, that those that perform better are more likely to survive to the next year. We also see again that performance from year 1 to 2 doesn't change, right? So that's just showing again that they aren't necessarily getting better with experience. This is something that's they're born with, is most likely, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, part of their genetics. There's a genetic underpinning to this behavior. Okay. Now, another question, so this is sort of one side of the fitness equation, right? Individuals have to survive and then they want to reproduce, right? They want to have babies because that sends on their genetic material. But both of those things are what contribute to fitness, right? So we've shown that it increases survival. So that's one. But the question is, do females care about this trait, right? We know females have a big influence on who they choose to mate with. And so by tracking their breeding behavior, we can look at when they lay their eggs, the size of their clutch, their brood size, and then the size of their nestlings, right? To see if individuals with better cognitive abilities actually produce more young. So if we look at, again, this is on our x-axis now. So we're just looking at the male mean errors. So the number of errors a male bird would make. So again, better being on the left side and worse being on the right, because fewer errors is a better performance. And then we're looking at clutch size on the y-axis there. And so what we see, regardless of elevation, is that females lay larger clutches when they're mated to males that have better spatial cognitive abilities, right? So that's pretty cool. We don't know exactly what's going on there, how females might know who has better and worse spatial cognitive abilities. I have some hypotheses I'll talk about in just a second. But just to follow up on that, that translates into larger brood sizes. And that's our estimate for birds that are actually going to fledge and leave the nest, right? So successfully fledge. And again, we see that same pattern manifesting there, where individuals who are mated to males with better cognitive abilities have larger broods. We actually don't see a relationship between male cognition and lay date or the nestling mass there, which is interesting in this 1 year of study. But what's interesting about this, again, is that it suggests that females are able to discriminate among males with better and worse cognitive abilities, which is pretty intriguing. The next piece of the puzzle, so again, we've shown that survival is enhanced with better cognitive ability. Females seem to increase their reproductive investment, so the number of chicks they're laying and producing when they're mated to males with better cognitive abilities. And then again, we've actually shown more recently that there is a genetic underpinning to this cognitive performance. So what we did is we took birds from our system that performed really well on our task and individuals that performed poorly on our task and didn't survive to the next year. And we can look across their genome, looking at millions of SNPs, essentially, which are what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms. So these are just little differences in the gene code. So you can see there on this little figure, it's showing, individuals this is an example, right? This is our abstract from this paper. And so basically, if there's an A in one and a G, for instance, in another that is associated with better or worse performance, we can quantify that across the entire genome and see if there are certain signatures that we see in the different populations. And we did this across elevations because, again, we know there are other genetic differences between high and low elevation birds. There's a whole host of physiological traits that high elevation birds might need versus low. So we accounted for that in our sampling. And indeed, these areas of the brain these areas of the genome that are different are associated with genes or close to genes related to neuron growth and development and areas or developmental issues with the hippocampus in the human work. So this is really exciting to us. And we've actually replicated this with a larger sample size and looking at a bit more complex of what's called a gene network approach, which I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of all of that, but it's pretty exciting to see, this trait that sometimes is thought of as labile or more flexible, something like cognition, like you could just learn to be better, right? That indeed there is this really strong genetic basis for this trait, that it is indeed heritable and gets passed on from generation to generation, which is really exciting. Okay, so to summarize this first part here, this most of this part. I have some more that I want to just share generally, but what we're seeing is that mountain chickadees exhibit cognitive adaptation on a really small spatial scale, right? So we see that the males or individuals that are performing better on the task are more likely to survive the winter. We also see that females can apparently discriminate among males with better and worse spatial cognition. And we actually have some really exciting results for that in the extra pair paternity world. This is a paper that's in review right now, where we've looked at if females prefer to mate with males who have better cognition, and this seems to be the case. So what we can look at is comparing their social male who helps raise the chicks to the extra pair male that isn't helping, right? And what we see is that they choose males with better cognition than their social male, which is pretty incredible. So that's some really exciting work that's hopefully coming out soon. And then finally, that there's a genetic basis to spatial cognitive abilities. So if we bring this back to Darwin himself and sort of what is required for adaptation to persist. So adaptations only exist by natural selection. And for that to occur, right, we need variation in the trait, which we know there's quite a bit of variation in this cognitive ability. It needs to be heritable. We've shown that. And it needs to confer this fitness advantage. And again, the two aspects of that being their ability to survive better and to produce more offspring, right? And so we actually see both of those things taking place here. So again, that fitness advantage exists. So it's like, haha, we've hypothesized for a really long time that natural selection is acting on spatial cognitive abilities of food caching birds, but actually showing it and convincing folks that this is true has been quite the challenge. And it's really exciting to see all of this work come together. But of course, if you're anything like me, and as I've alluded to, you're wondering how in the heck can females know how birds are performing? And so one option is that they're directly observing them when they're actually in flocks together. They can actually watch the other males be successful or unsuccessful in caching, right? And then there's secondary sexual traits. So things like variation in their bird song, variation in their plumage. They may also hint to this or might be associated with their cognitive abilities. So individuals that are better and higher quality, better able to survive, that may have better cognition, then also might have, brighter plumage. They may have better song production, things like that. I will say, we've been looking at these traits. So we're looking at song in these birds both. So here's a little, if you don't know the mountain chickadee song, here's how it sounds. And then slowed down. Ah, yes. And everybody called it the cheeseburger bird, which I did not learn until I moved to Nevada. But we're looking at different structural elements of their song production. We're also looking at sort of daily singing routine. So how much they're singing throughout the day, when are they singing, to see if that's associated with cognitive ability. So far, the structural measures aren't particularly convincing, which is interesting. The other thing we're looking at again is plumage reflectance. So, unlike us, birds can actually see in the ultraviolet wavelength of the light spectrum. And so we can quantify the variation in their plumage regions on their heads, particularly the contrast for these little chickadees, and see how they differ among these different patches and how much contrast there is, and see if there's anything associated with cognitive abilities there. And we do see some more convincing evidence in this round with the plumage. It does seem like individuals with more contrast, so with these darker black patches and brighter white patches, that they do perform better on cognitive tasks. So we're still working through some of this data to get it published, but these are the things in the works now. I will say, I honestly think most likely they know these individuals really well. They live in these flocks all winter, then they separate out into pairs in the spring and summer, and their neighbors who they end up extra pair mating with are males they probably know and probably spent the whole fall and winter with. So they may have an inkling about their cognitive abilities and their quality overall. With that, I just want to say thanks to all of the collaborators that have worked on this. So, I always say that science is a team sport. None of this work is done by ourselves. It's a huge team effort to collect all of this data. And I know work with some really smart, great people. So thank you. And thank you for your attention.